Hey, stop. Let me see your ID now.
For what crime, officer? Say it.
Fit a description. Turn around. Hands behind your back.
No reasonable suspicion. That's an unlawful detention.
Refusing is obstruction.
Special Agent Marcus Sterling, DEA. Verify it. Touch me and you just bought your departmental
DEA
lawsuit.
is part.
Officer Derek Vance had been with the Chicago Police Department for 7 years. 7 years that included 14 complaints, all dismissed or closed with minimal action. He was known among his colleagues for what they euphemistically called aggressive, proactive policing, stopping people based on hunches, gut feelings, and profiles he'd built in his own mind. His field training officers had noted concerns about implicit bias during his probationary period. But those notes had been buried in his digital file, never acted upon. One Friday evening in Chicago's Gold Coast district, Vance's pattern of profiling collided with a federal agent who knew the law better than he did. And that confrontation would cost the department $5.2 million and expose a systemic failure that had been ignored for years. I'm Special Agent Marcus Sterling. I've been investigating international drug cartels for the Drug Enforcement Administration DEA for 16 years. 16 years of wiretap surveillance operations and undercover work that has dismantled supply chains and put violent criminals behind bars. I've testified in federal court 42 times. I've coordinated with Interpol and local task forces. My record is spotless. My credentials are unimpeachable. That Friday evening, I was just trying to meet a colleague for dinner, walking down a busy street in broad daylight, wearing business casual attire, carrying nothing but my phone and wallet. No crime, no suspicious behavior, no reason for any law enforcement contact. But Officer Vance saw me and decided in that instant that something was wrong, and that decision would shatter careers, ignite protests, and force uncomfortable questions about who police see as threats and why. Before I continue, where are you watching from? If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like mine need to be shared, and your support helps us bring more truth to light. The Gold Coast is one of Chicago's most affluent districts. High-end shopping along the Magnificent Mile, upscale steakhouses, luxury condos, and corporate offices. The streets are clean, the sidewalks busy with professionals, tourists, and residents. It's the kind of neighborhood where police presence is usually subtle, where most interactions are cordial, where the assumption is that everyone belongs unless you look like me. It was 6:47 p.m. on a Friday in early October. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across Michigan Avenue. The weather was perfect, mid-60s clear skies, a brisk breeze coming off the lake. People walked dogs. Couples strolled to dinner reservations. Business professionals headed home after long weeks. I had spent the day at the DEA's Chicago Field Division reviewing surveillance footage from an ongoing trafficking investigation. It had been tedious work hours of watching grainy video, documenting movements, building timelines. I was tired and ready for a good meal and casual conversation. I had arranged to meet my colleague, Special Agent Sarah Jenkins, at a grill 6 blocks from the office. Rather than drive, I decided to walk, stretch my legs, clear my head, enjoy the evening air. I was 44 years old, fit, clean-cut. I wore gray slacks, a crisp white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to my elbows, and polished black loafers. My DEA credentials were in my front pocket as always. My service weapon was holstered at my hip, concealed under my shirt. I looked exactly like what I was, a federal law enforcement professional off duty, but always prepared. I walked with purpose but not urgency, checking my phone, occasionally nodding at people I passed. I belonged there. I had every right to be there. I wasn't doing anything wrong. But to Officer Derek Vance, something about me triggered suspicion. And that suspicion, rooted in bias rather than evidence, was about to explode into a confrontation that would make national headlines. Derek Vance was 31 years old. He joined the Chicago Police Department 7 years earlier. Fresh from the academy, with idealistic notions about fighting crime and protecting communities. But those ideals had quickly morphed into something darker, a belief that certain people in certain places were inherently suspicious. Vance had generated his first complaint within 5 months of solo patrol. He'd stopped a black woman in her Porsche convinced the car was stolen. It wasn't. She was a neurosurgeon, driving home from the hospital. The complaint alleged racial profiling. Internal Affairs investigated, found insufficient evidence of bias, and closed the case with a recommendation for cultural sensitivity training. Vance attended a half-day workshop and returned to patrol. The second complaint came 8 months later. A black businessman in a tailored suit walking through a parking garage. Vance stopped him, demanded ID, questioned why he was there. The man owned the building. Another complaint, another investigation, another training recommendation. Over the next 6 years, 12 more complaints followed. Each one told the same story. Vance stopping black professionals in affluent areas, demanding explanations for their presence, refusing to accept that they belonged. Each complaint was investigated. Each investigation found insufficient evidence of intentional bias. Each time, Vance received more training and remained on patrol. His supervisors knew about the pattern. His file was thick with incident reports and civilian complaints, but no one ever asked the obvious question: at what point does a pattern become proof? Vance had learned to justify his stops carefully. Fit a description, suspicious behavior, community concern. He knew the language that would satisfy incident reports and protect him from discipline. By the time he encountered me, Derek Vance had been trained 12 times on implicit bias, cultural sensitivity, and constitutional policing, and he'd learned nothing. Do you think officers with 10 or more complaints should be automatically removed from patrol? Drop your answer below. Vance was on patrol in the Gold Coast, driving slowly through the district, scanning pedestrians and vehicles. It was part of what he called proactive policing, looking for anything that didn't fit anyone who seemed out of place. He saw me from a block away. A black man, walking alone, dressed casually, but not poorly, moving with confidence through an affluent, predominantly white neighborhood. In Vance's mind, shaped by 7 years of unchecked bias, something was wrong. The clothes were too nice to be legitimate. The confidence was suspicious. The presence was unexplained. He pulled his patrol car to the curb and watched. I walked past a row of high-end retail stores, glanced at my phone, and continued walking. Normal behavior, the actions of someone going somewhere they had every right to be. But Vance had already decided what he was seeing. This was someone who didn't belong, someone worth questioning. He got out of his car and followed on foot, maintaining distance, watching. I stopped at a crosswalk, waited for the light, and crossed. Vance crossed behind me, closing the gap. When I reached the next block, Vance called out, "Sir, excuse me, sir." I stopped and turned. I saw the uniform, the badge, the posture of authority. I'd been a federal agent long enough to know when an interaction was heading somewhere problematic. "Yes, officer." My voice was calm, professional. Vance approached, his hand resting near his belt. "Sir, I need you to step back and show me some identification." I didn't move. "Before I do that, tell me what law you think I'm breaking." Vance's jaw tightened. "You fit a description." My eyes narrowed slightly. "A description or an assumption?" "Both." Vance stepped closer, his voice hardening. "Now turn around, hands behind your back." This was the moment where an officer's bias collided with a citizen's rights, where authority met knowledge. where the balance of power shifted in ways Vance hadn't anticipated. I stood perfectly still. My voice remained calm, but the authority in it was unmistakable. Special Agent Marcus Sterling, DEA, and you just made a very serious mistake. Vance froze, his face flushed. But instead of backing down, instead of de-escalating, his pride kicked in. I don't care if you're DEA, CIA, or the president. You fit a description, and I'm detaining you. What description? I asked evenly. Be specific. What crime was reported, when, where? And what description am I supposedly matching? Vance stammered. There was a call about suspicious activity in this area. When was the call? Earlier today. How much earlier? What time? What location specifically? What was the described suspect wearing? Height, weight, distinguishing features? Vance had no answers because there was no call. There was no description. There was only bias, wrapped in the language of law enforcement authority. I could see it on Vance's face. The realization that he'd been caught in a lie. The panic that comes from knowing you've overstepped, but feeling too committed to retreat. Officer, I said, my voice dropping into something colder. You have two choices right now. You can acknowledge that you have no reasonable suspicion, no probable cause, and no legal basis for this stop. Or you can continue, and I promise you it will end your career. Should officers be required to cite specific, verifiable information before any detention? Let me know what you think. Vance's hand moved to his handcuffs. Turn around. Now. I didn't move. I'm not turning around. I'm not complying with an unlawful order. You have no grounds for detention. You're resisting. I'm exercising my Fourth Amendment rights. There's a difference. A small crowd had begun to gather. A woman pulled out her phone and started recording. A couple stopped and watched. A doorman from a nearby hotel approached, concerned. Vance felt the eyes on him, felt the pressure, felt his authority being challenged in public, and instead of recognizing that he was wrong, he doubled down. Last warning, Vance said. Hands behind your back, or you're under arrest for obstruction. I pulled my DEA credentials from my pocket slowly, deliberately, every movement visible. I held them up. The gold shield caught the streetlight. The identification card was clear. Special Agent Marcus Sterling, DEA badge number 4291, Chicago Field Division. You can verify this with one phone call. My voice was steady, but the anger underneath was palpable. You stopped me without cause. You demanded ID without reasonable suspicion. You threatened arrest for asserting my rights. And now you're going to arrest a federal agent because your ego won't let you admit you were wrong. Vance stared at the credentials. They looked real, but he'd convinced himself that they couldn't be, that this was a trick, that criminals carried fake badges all the time. Those could be counterfeit, Vance said. My expression didn't change, but something in my eyes went cold. They're not, and you know they're not, but you're so deep into this stop, so committed to the narrative you've built, that you can't back down. Turn around. No, Vance grabbed my arm. I pulled back instinctively, not violently, not aggressively, but firmly. Don't touch me. You have no legal authority to detain me. Vance yanked harder, trying to spin me around. I maintained my balance, my training evident. I didn't strike back, didn't escalate, but I didn't submit either. You're under arrest for resisting an officer, Vance shouted loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. The woman recording spoke up. He's DEA. He showed you his badge. What are you doing? Vance ignored her. He tried to force my arms behind my back. I resisted the attempt, using my body weight and positioning to prevent it. For 30 seconds, we struggled. Vance trying to assert control, me refusing to be controlled unlawfully. And then a voice cut through the chaos. Vance, stand down, T. Sergeant Elena Rossi had been driving past when she saw the commotion. A 25-year veteran, she recognized trouble when she saw it. She parked quickly and approached her hand up in a calming gesture. "Step back, Vance. Now." Vance released my arm, but didn't step away. "Sarge, this individual was acting suspiciously and refused to comply." I said, "Step back." Rossi's voice carried the weight of 2 decades of authority. Vance stepped back, breathing hard, his face red. Rossi turned to me. "Sir, I'm Sergeant Rossi. Can you tell me what happened?" I straightened my shirt, composed, but clearly angry. "Your officer stopped me without cause, demanded ID without reasonable suspicion, and attempted to arrest me when I questioned his authority. I identified myself as DEA. I showed him my credentials. I held them up again. He called them fake and tried to detain me anyway." Rossi took the credentials and examined them carefully. Her expression shifted immediately. Recognition, then dismay, then something close to anger. "These are real," she said quietly. She looked at Vance. "You tried to arrest a federal agent. I didn't know you didn't verify. There's a difference." She turned back to me. "Agent Sterling, I apologize. This stop was inappropriate." I nodded but said nothing. My eyes were on Vance, who stood off to the side, still trying to process how badly he'd miscalculated. Why do some officers double down instead of admitting mistakes? Comment your thoughts. The woman who'd been recording approached Sergeant Rossi. "I have the whole thing on video, from the beginning. Can I see?" The woman played the footage. It showed everything. Vance approaching without cause. Me asking for legal justification. Vance ordering me to turn around. Me showing my credentials. Vance calling them fake. The physical struggle. Rossi's face darkened as she watched. "Ma'am, would you be willing to send that to the department?" "I'm sending it everywhere," the woman said. "This is wrong. That man didn't do anything." Another witness stepped forward, the doorman from the nearby hotel. "I saw the whole thing too. That officer stopped him for no reason. The gentleman was just walking." Rossi looked at Vance. Her voice was quiet, controlled, but the fury underneath was obvious. "Get back to your vehicle. Don't say anything, don't move, wait for a supervisor." Vance walked back to his patrol car, moving like someone in a daze. Rossi turned to me. "Agent Sterling, I know this was wrong. You have every right to file a complaint, and I'll personally ensure you receive all body camera footage and incident reports." I nodded. "I'll be filing more than a complaint, Sergeant. I'll be filing a federal civil rights lawsuit. This wasn't a mistake. This was profiling. And I'm willing to bet it's not the first time he's done it." Rossi didn't disagree. "I understand. And honestly, you're probably right." A supervisor arrived 10 minutes later. Lieutenant James Harper, a 19-year veteran with a reputation for integrity. Rossi briefed him, showed him the video from the witness's phone, and explained what she'd observed. Harper listened, his expression grim. Then he walked over to Vance's patrol car. "Officer Vance, you're suspended effective immediately. Internal Affairs will contact you within 24 hours. Do not discuss this incident with anyone. Do not post about it on social media. Go home." Vance nodded mutely. Harper approached me next. "Agent Sterling, I'm Lieutenant Harper. I've just watched the video. I've heard the witness statements, and I want you to know that what happened here is completely unacceptable. We will cooperate fully with any investigation, and this officer will face consequences." My voice was controlled, but the anger was still there. "Lieutenant, I've worked with local police departments all over this country. I've coordinated joint operations. I've testified alongside local officers. I've never been stopped, questioned, and physically grabbed by an officer who refused to believe my credentials. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was bias, pure and simple." Harper didn't argue. "You're right, and I'm sorry." By that evening, the witness video had been uploaded to social media. Within hours, it was viral. DEA agent profiled and nearly arrested in Chicago while walking to dinner. Federal officer grabbed by cop who refused to believe his badge. $5.2 million lawsuit filed after agent stopped without cause. The story exploded. Local news, national news, civil rights organizations, DEA statements. The video had everything clear evidence of profiling an officer, refusing to verify obvious credentials, a federal agent staying calm while his rights were violated. Should body cameras automatically upload to independent servers in real time? Drop your answer. The DEA's Chicago Field Division issued a statement within 12 hours. We are aware of an incident involving one of our agents and the Chicago Police Department. The matter is under review, and we are cooperating with all appropriate investigations. The safety and rights of our personnel are paramount. Behind the scenes, the response was far less diplomatic. DEA leadership was furious. The Chicago Police Department's Internal Affairs Division launched an immediate investigation. The Department of Justice opened a civil rights inquiry. What they found was damning. Officer Derek Vance had 14 complaints over 7 years. 14. All involving stops of black individuals in affluent areas. All alleging racial profiling. All closed without meaningful discipline. The pattern was undeniable. Year 1. 2 complaints, both alleging stops without reasonable suspicion. Outcome, training recommended, no discipline. Year 2, 1 complaint, alleged unlawful detention. Outcome, insufficient evidence, case closed. Year 3, 4 complaints, all alleging racial profiling in the Gold Coast. Outcome, additional bias, training required, no suspension. Year 4, 2 complaints, 1 involving physical contact during a stop. Outcome, counseling by supervisor, return to full duty. Year 5, 2 complaints, alleged false arrest. Outcome, case settled by city before formal investigation completed. Year 6/7, 3 complaints, including my incident. The internal review revealed something worse. Supervisors had identified the pattern 3 years earlier. A memo from a lieutenant to a captain specifically noted Vance's concerning tendency to initiate contacts with black individuals in predominantly white neighborhoods without apparent justification. The recommendation in that memo, reassignment to administrative duties pending comprehensive retraining. The outcome memo filed, no action taken. The Chicago Police Department had known Derek Vance was a liability. They documented it. They discussed it internally, and they had done nothing. Civil rights attorneys contacted me within days. The case was straightforward. Unlawful stop, unlawful detention attempt, violation of civil rights, and a documented pattern of similar conduct by the officer. The lawsuit named Officer Derek Vance, his direct supervisor, Sergeant William Banks, Lieutenant Edward Monroe, who'd written the ignored memo, and the Chicago Police Department. The allegations were comprehensive, unlawful stop without reasonable suspicion in violation of the Fourth Amendment, racial profiling and discrimination in violation of federal civil rights statutes, attempted false arrest and false imprisonment, use of force without legal justification, intentional infliction of emotional distress, failure to train, supervise, and discipline officers with documented patterns of constitutional violations, deliberate indifference to citizens' rights by departmental leadership. The city's legal team reviewed the evidence. The witness video showing the entire encounter, Vance's history of complaints, the internal memo documenting supervisory awareness of the problem, body camera footage confirming my version of events, Their conclusion, indefensible. Settlement negotiations began within 3 months. The city offered $2.5 million. My attorneys countered at $18 million, citing the egregious nature of the stop, the documented pattern of abuse, and the department's knowing failure to act. They settled at $5.2 million, one of the largest civil rights settlements in Chicago's history, for a stop that didn't result in arrest or injury. The settlement included provisions beyond money mandatory reform of the complaint review process, creation of an early intervention system to identify officers with complaint patterns, quarterly audits of all officer stops analyzed for racial disparities, a community oversight board with subpoena power, and public reporting of complaint statistics and outcomes. Officer Derek Vance was terminated 9 weeks after the incident. The termination letter was precise and damning. Officer Vance engaged in conduct that violated constitutional protections, department policy, and the public trust. Despite numerous complaints and training interventions over 7 years, Officer Vance continued a pattern of discriminatory enforcement. His actions endangered public safety, damaged community relations, and exposed the department to significant legal liability. His employment is terminated for cause effective immediately. Vance's certification was revoked. His name was entered into the National Decertification Index. He would never work in law enforcement again. He attempted to appeal, arguing that the termination was excessive and that he'd been following his training. The appeal was denied. The evidence was overwhelming. Vance issued a statement through his attorney. "I made serious errors in judgment that I deeply regret. I accept responsibility for my actions and apologize to Agent Sterling and the community." The apology rang hollow. 14 complaints, 7 years, hundreds of stops. The pattern wasn't an error, it was a choice. Should officers with 5 or more civil rights complaints lose their badge automatically? Let me know in the comments. The Department of Justice's investigation went beyond Derek Vance. They examined the Chicago Police Department's entire complaint review system. What they found was institutional failure at every level. Key findings: complaint review failures. Complaints were reviewed individually, never aggregated to identify patterns. An officer could have 10 complaints of the same type, and each would be treated as an isolated incident. Inadequate training: officers received bias training, but there was no assessment of whether the training changed behavior. Officers attended workshops, signed forms, and returned to patrol with no follow-up. Supervisory negligence. Supervisors were aware of problem officers but faced pressure to maintain staffing levels. Problem officers were easier to keep than to replace. Lack of accountability. The department culture prioritized protecting officers over protecting constitutional rights. Complaints were viewed as attacks on police, not opportunities to improve. No early intervention. Despite having data on complaint patterns, the department had no system to intervene before officers like Vance caused serious harm. The DOJ issued a scathing report with mandatory reforms implementation of an early intervention system within 6 months. Independent review of all complaints alleging racial bias. Quarterly statistical analysis of all stop searches and uses of force with racial disparities reported publicly. De-escalation training for all officers with annual recertification. A community advisory board with authority to review and recommend discipline. Federal monitoring for 5 years. The reforms were court-ordered, not suggestions, requirements. Chicago's mayor issued a public apology. What happened to Special Agent Sterling should never have happened. It represents a failure of supervision training and accountability. We are committed to reform, and we will regain the community's trust. I testified before the City Council during the reform process. My testimony was measured but powerful. I'm a federal agent, I told them. I have resources, I have legal knowledge, I have institutional backing. And even with all of that, I was profiled, stopped unlawfully, and physically grabbed by an officer who refused to believe I had the right to walk down a public street. Now imagine what happens to people who don't have what I have. People who don't know their rights, people who can't afford attorneys, people who don't have badges or federal agencies backing them up. Officer Vance stopped me because he couldn't imagine that a black man belonged in the Gold Coast. That's the reality. And until departments confront that reality, admit it, and actively work to change it, this will keep happening. The question isn't whether Officer Vance was biased. The evidence is clear. The question is why the department allowed him to continue that pattern for 7 years. Why 14 complaints weren't enough to trigger intervention. Why a lieutenant's memo recommending reassignment was ignored. Those are the systemic failures that enabled what happened to me. And those are the failures you must fix. The council chamber was silent when I finished. This wasn't just about Derek Vance making a bad decision. This was about a system that enabled protected and perpetuated biased policing. Vance didn't develop his pattern in a vacuum. He learned quickly that he could stop black people in white neighborhoods, that complaints wouldn't lead to consequences, that supervisors would defend him, that the system would protect him. Every complaint that was dismissed taught him he was untouchable. Every training session he attended, without real accountability, reinforced that lesson. Every year, he remained on patrol, despite the mounting evidence, told him that his behavior was acceptable. The Chicago Police Department created Derek Vance. Not intentionally, perhaps, but through negligence, indifference, and a culture that valued covering for officers over protecting citizens' rights. And I paid the price. Not with my life, not with physical injury, but with my dignity, with my sense of safety in my own city, with the knowledge that even my credentials, my service, my federal badge weren't enough to protect me from being seen as a threat. This is what systemic racism looks like when it wears a badge. It's not always Klan hoods and burning crosses. Sometimes it's an officer who just has a feeling that someone doesn't belong. Sometimes it's a supervisor who files a memo and does nothing. Sometimes it's a department that treats patterns as anomalies and complaints as nuisances. And when that system is empowered by law, by authority, by qualified immunity, and police unions, and political protection, it doesn't just harm individuals. It corrupts the entire relationship between police and communities. Derek Vance's career is over. That's justice. The city paid $5.2 million. That's accountability. The department implemented reforms. That's progress. But none of that changes what happened to me. None of that erases the humiliation of being grabbed on a public street. None of that restores the presumption that I belong in my own city. The real question is whether these reforms will last, whether the early intervention system will actually intervene, whether supervisors will act on red flags before the 14th complaint, whether training will change behavior instead of just checking boxes. Because if we don't fundamentally change how departments handle officers like Derek Vance, if we don't make it impossible for patterns to be ignored, then we're just waiting for the next stop, the next victim, the next lawsuit. Comment below if you believe departments should face federal oversight after any $1 million plus civil rights settlement. And if you think these stories matter, if you believe accountability requires visibility, if you want to see real change in how police interact with communities, then hit that subscribe button. Because we're going to keep telling these stories. We're going to keep exposing the patterns. We're going to keep demanding that the system work for everyone, not just some. This isn't just about one officer or one federal agent. It's about the world we're building, the accountability we demand, and the rights we refuse to surrender. This story is a dramatization based on real events, but all names, locations shifted to Chicago, ages, and specific identifying details have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved and to illustrate a broader educational point. The narrative is presented to educate the public on civil rights, the Fourth Amendment, the concept of reasonable suspicion, and the mechanisms of systemic accountability within law enforcement institutions. It serves as a case study in how implicit bias can affect policing and the legal ramifications that follow when constitutional rights are violated. This story is not intended to disparage all law enforcement, but to highlight the necessity of oversight, proper training, and the fair application of the law for every citizen.